Hi everyone. Poetry has often been called the Cinderella genre. You don't write poetry for fame or fortune, because fame is very hard to come by in the poetry world, and you definitely don't write it for fortune, because poetry just doesn't pay. So poetry is written for love. But the interesting thing about poetry is that it wasn't always the sister that sat at home by the fire. Once upon a time, poetry, believe it or not, was an Olympic sport. How many people knew that? Ah, okay. That's right. In 1948, a South African poet, Ernest van Heerden, won a silver medal for his entry called Ses Gedichte, or Six Poems. So I was really delighted when I was approached by Nikki to participate in this 2016 Writers2000 poetry competition, because I thought, yay, people still love poetry. So I've really been thrilled to be part of it, and I was so thrilled with the level of poetry that I read. I received 13 poems, and I had such a difficult time. I was telling the other judges at the table during lunch that when you start evaluating a competition, you start reading with your first reading, and you sort of expect to have one large pile of immediate rejects and sort of a little pile that you sort of have to reread and start to choose and nitpick. Well, I tell you, I was just like, keep all the time, because the poems that I read were really of a very high standard. Now, poetry is very, very subjective. I mean, I think all writing, except perhaps the technical writing and travel writing and that, but fiction and poetry, it's really subjective, and it depends a lot on personal taste. So I tried to turn this into an objective exercise, and so I looked at two aspects for all the poems. I looked at the technical aspect, and I looked at the artistic aspect. Now, the technical aspect is things like style, language, presentation. What is the punctuation like? Is the grammar correct? How does the poem actually fit on the page? Has the structure of the poem being used to enhance the meaning? That's the technical side. And then the artistic side is things like the impact. How did that poem actually impact on me at the first reading and the second reading? And what is the imagery like, and what is the mood like? So those were the two main sort of evaluation criteria that I used, technical and artistic. Now, my husband and I tend to watch sort of alternative DVDs, and we were watching a music video by Sir John Tavener. And afterwards, they have those interviews with the artists and those kind of things. And Sir John Tavener spoke about William Blake's poetry, and he said that what he finds absolutely fascinating about William Blake's poetry is that he's not technically proficient. As a poet and as an artist, William Blake was not really a technical expert, but his poetry had such vision, and he had such poetic genius in what he wrote, that is why 200 plus years later, William Blake is considered one of the greatest poets. So, to me, what separates poetry from prose is that artistic element. Obviously, it has to be technically good as well, but it's the artistic element that, to me, raises a poem above the ordinary. Because the poetic voice is at the heart of the art of poetry. Now, what made the Writers2000 2016 poetry entries extraordinary? I think it was, first of all, the wide range of themes and voices. The themes were everything from evolution to love in all its aspects, family love, rejected love, beautiful love, ending of love affairs, and there was a lot of themes and a lot of voices, which was very nice for me to read. The most excellent part of all the poems I read was the imagery. There really was a lot of talented expressions of images that just enhanced the poems. The Smoky Jazz Club, I could smell the smoke, I could feel that bluesy atmosphere, I could feel the hum and the buzz of a jazz club. A child abandoned in a driveway, I felt this, I could see in my mind this little child sitting at, it like really moved me, that image. And another one that struck me, and it was so funny because the other day in where we live we had thunder early in the morning, and it reminded me of one of the poems I read which used the metaphor of equating thunder with God moving furniture. And as the thunder was going around our house, I thought, oh, God's moving furniture. So the poems really moved me. But obviously there were a few areas where I felt some of the poetry could improve. And the main thing that I felt a lot of the poets were doing was they were actually trying too hard to be poetic. You know, brevity, I can't remember who said it, that, I think it was you, Anthony, that brevity is the soul of lingerie, but brevity is also the soul of poetry. And sometimes when you try too hard to be a poet, it actually takes away from that natural expression of the emotion, because that is what poetry is all about. It's about emotion. And when you try to be poetic, it will become a little bit awkward. And perhaps the best piece of advice I can give is just trust the poetic process, trust your poetic voice. You can always fix up the other stuff later. Just sit down and let that emotion, whatever, whether it's an intellectual emotion, like you're admiring something or you're philosophizing about something, just let those feelings come out onto the page. Later on you can fix up the technique. So that's the one thing. Don't try too hard to be poetic and trust the process. And then also there was sometimes a slight misuse of words or a phrase. For example, the one poem, it was a very sad poem, it was a very melancholy poem, and right towards the end they used the term fleeting memory. Now it's a very small thing, but fleeting memory has a positive connotation, where perhaps it would have been better to use a word like a scarred memory, which would have been more in keeping with the tone of the poem. And sometimes the evil rhyme theory controlled the poets rather than the poets controlling the evil rhyme theory. So always be very careful. Obviously we think poetry, rhyme, you know, but sometimes an internal rhyme is enough. You don't have to force a rhyme at the end of a stanza or at the end of a line. But on the whole, really, all of the entries were fantastic, but there could only be one winner, so I had to start sifting through, and the poems that made it through the first and the second and the third and the fourth round of readings were those poems that combined technical skill with artistic excellence. And I was left with five fabulous poems that all engaged my intellect, my emotions, and my attention. I couldn't just not acknowledge those poems, so I've got two highly commended poems. I would like to start in no particular order. The Giant Buddha of Leshan by Confucius. This, I love that. This was a stately, gracious poem with a final stanza that perfectly captured the essence of the topic. So I'd like Confucius to... Oh, sorry. Duncan Steptoe. Well done. It was a great poem, really. Thanks very much. The second highly commended poem was Rulers of the Forest by Forest King. This was a well-structured poem that celebrated the seasons with some beautiful natural imagery. And I'd like to call Forest King, who's doubling up as a video technician, to come and collect her certificate. Congratulations, Megan. It was a great poem. Thank you. Thanks. The third place poem was an intelligent, thought-provoking poem about evolution. it kept me thinking about it long after I'd stopped reading. You know, it raised questions in my mind. You know, we're all going to be a pile of bones one day, and you know, we're going to be in that cave with the little dust motes and some future archaeologists. It was really a thought-provoking poem with great imagery. So I'd like to call Emergence by Dem Bones to come up and collect the third place prize. And I think I recognize your car. Do you have ID fossils on your car?
No.
Is that yours? I thought I'd seen it. But thank you, it's great. I'm really enjoying it. I had some real difficult moments deciding between the first and second place poems. I really struggled to choose. They were both technically good with excellent artistic impact. But in the end, why the one poem rose above the other was that the winning poem did not falter in the powerful expression of its poetic voice, while the second place poem, in the middle of the poem, it just briefly slipped out of poetry into prose. And that, I think, is what was the difference between the first and the second place poems. The second place poem is still an outstanding poem. It was a quiet, reflective poem that, you know, several times I actually felt like the little tears come to my eyes, and I felt my throat closing with emotion. And what made it even nicer was that it ended on a note of hope and inspiration and acceptance that I think could inspire people of any age through a major transition. And this poem was called Shedding by New Beginnings. So I would like to call
Jill Jakes.
Jill Jakes. The winning poem was completely different. It was unashamedly bitter, angry, and hurt. You and I, by your ghost, burnt up the page with passion. It used excellent technique that was completely invisible. The strong, powerful impact of the poems and of the poem and the words and the emotion being poured out just dragged me through the poet's experience so that I was completely unaware of the technique that was used. And the words just scorched the page. And I really felt that this is a well-deserved winning poem, and I would like to call Your Ghost up to collect the... Anyway, I really had some great time reading those poems, and please carry on writing, and hopefully one day we'll be back in the Olympics as poetry poets, and hopefully some of our poets here can win a couple of medals for us. Thank you very much for Oh, wonderful. I'm going to keep it from my husband.
Okay, I did the way.
Oh, thanks so much.